Welcome to this webinar on Beyond Value, the True Purpose of Collecting Art. So I'm Renee Adams. I'm a professor of finance at Said Business School and the academic lead for the Art at Said program. And I will be moderating this webinar. And with me here today, I have Lizzie Collins from Stoneman Collins and Annika Guntram from Gurjans in France. And before we get started, first, the way it's going to work, I'm going to ask Lizzie and Annika to introduce themselves briefly. And we're going to then get right into business and discuss the art market and what value means in the context of the art market. The webinar is going to be recorded and will be available on the Said Business School website. There's an Art at Said webpage, so please go and look for the webinar recording if you're interested. Please do ask questions as we go along. We may ask you some questions to see what you think about the topics that we're discussing, but please do engage because it'll make the experience for everyone much more exciting and fun. So first I'd like to ask maybe Annika, do you want to start and introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, thank you, Renee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I am the managing director of Gurjans, the art advisory firm, which is based in London, founded in 1914. And after 30 years with Christie's between New York and Paris offices, I left last year to open the Paris office. So we are a new jewel in the Gurjans crown. With offices and representation worldwide.
All right, thanks a lot. And Lizzie?
Well, thank you again also for having me. So I'm an art advisor. I've just set up a business called Stoneman Collins as a dedicated art advisory. I work for a private collector with an international collection. I have a background also as an auctioneer. I also worked at auction houses at every level, actually, from local to international. And I've also run a gallery for 10 years, so I've got a diverse experience. And I've been involved with Art at Said now for with setting it up initially and just, again, relaunching it now. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation.
Great. Well, thanks so much to both of you for joining us in this conversation. Now, for those of you who have signed on to this webinar, you may wonder, what's a business school doing having a program about art? So we've actually, with Lizzie's help, we have an exhibition at the business school. It's an art exhibition, and one reason that we have it is to communicate about ideas that we teach and that we do research on. And of course, in a business school, there's probably no more important concept than the concept of value. Now in the context, what does value actually mean in the context of the art market? I think it has many different meanings. So is it monetary? Is it social? And so those are those types of questions that we'd like to address today. So Annika, let me start with you. So you just came out of the New York sales. How would you say the market compares this year to previous years? And what factors do you think might explain any changes?
Well, it's a very good question. There have been a lot of changes and evolutions in the art market in the last 2 years. The market is generally down by a volume sense over the last 2 years. We're looking at a 20 to 30% drop in volume sort of per year. So over the last 2 to 3 years, that represents quite a significant decrease in sales. And this is primarily due to volume, not necessarily lowered prices, globally speaking, though it is very difficult, I should just say that, to generalize about the art market because the market does move at different speeds according to different value levels. But I can say that in 2024, for example, the global market, not just auctions, declined by 12%. So that was a big contraction. The auction sales this year, if we take the Christie's evening sale, the total for the evening sale this year declined by 52% over last year's evening sale total. So that's a really big drop. And this is coming on the heels of already 2024 numbers having decreased, over 20%. So the last 2 years have been very challenging for especially the auction houses, which have very high overhead, and it's very difficult to control costs because it's such a competitive environment.
Wow, that's an incredible drop. So, I mean, the mood must have been a bit grim, I can imagine.
Yes, the, the auction house teams were very nervous. The two houses, Christie's and Sotheby's, ultimately had quite different results. Um, Christie's auction, the evening sale, there was a collection sale, the Riggio collection, and their various owners' evening sale. So collectively, the two sales made almost $500 million, which is in numbers wise a great result. But most works sold on the low estimate. There was very little competitive bidding. So it didn't look like the market, like there was a really great depth of bidding in the market. But they did sell almost every lot, which is a real feat, with the top lot of the evening being withdrawn. It was the Warhol electric chair, which was estimated around $30 million. So that was withdrawn just prior to the sale, which proves that actually the demand at the top end of the market is really thin. And this is, I would say, the area of the market that's been most highly affected since the pandemic, since COVID. This is really where we're seeing a great contraction and difficulty, a real struggle in the prices. There's a few reasons for that, which I'll get to in a minute. But if we look at the Sotheby's evening sale, which just barely, I think they made $190 million in their evening sale. Their top lot, the Alberto Giacometti Head of Diego, was unsold. So they did not withdraw it from the sale as Christie's had withdrawn the Warhol. The advantage of withdrawing it is that those numbers come out of the global reporting numbers. So Sotheby's did leave the head in and it was unsold. It was estimated at around $70 million. So that's a big chunk out of their global total. But the rest of the sale did very well, and there was a lot of competitive bidding. And I think about 40% of the sale results were over the high end of the estimate. So the two auction houses, the results were really, at the two poles of, the auction possibilities. It was very interesting to see the difference.
Wow, that is interesting. But so what would you attribute? Do you have any sort of sense of what explains why like one auction house is doing pretty well, but the other one not so well? Like and why might the changes this year from last year, what might explain that?
Yeah, and well, financially, Christie's is actually doing better than Sotheby's. It's just that the actual mechanics of the sale at Sotheby's, in terms of an auction mechanic, driving competitive bidding to achieve the best result, that seemed to function better at Sotheby's than it did at Christie's. But Christie's still made over twice the amount that Sotheby's did. So it just shows that Christie's were pushing the auction estimates to their absolute limit, which is probably driven from the competition between the two auction houses for the great property. So Christie's won more property with the estimates being at the market level. So they're selling on one bid at the market price in the auction room. And Sotheby's had material that was generally very fresh to the market. There were artists' works that were included that are very, very hot right now. Georgia O'Keeffe, female surrealism. All of these artists have great demand, and there's a real depth of bidding in those pockets. And their sale was really focused on a very desirable material. And it shows that when the great material is there and it's reasonably estimated, you can have a great depth of bidding.
Okay, so let me just pick up on one thing that you mentioned about female surrealism being popular, which is surprising what's going on in the US right now in terms of anti-diversity sentiment. But so you don't necessarily see that reflected in the art market, or do you feel like the political situation is reflected in the art market?
Well, female surrealism and surrealism in general has increased in value over the last 2 years. We've seen a real rise in this market. Um, Female surrealists have generally been undervalued in a dramatic sense, and there still is a lot of great quality material available on the market. So these two elements are really driving the current, price bump that we see in this sector. Magritte, a male surrealist. I think that's the one single artist where we've seen such magnificent growth in the last 2 or 3 years. It's shocking. Prices have doubled and tripled from what they were 5 years ago, and it's pretty astounding. And I would say it's almost the unique artist where we've seen this kind of a jump. But generally speaking, and going back to, why there is this downturn in the market, I think that's a really important point to address, because generally speaking, art has a pretty low correlation to traditional markets. So the stock market goes up and down, but the art market tends to be more stable. It's a much more long-term investment. But I think what we're finally seeing now, especially after the COVID, is the direct result of rising inflation, fluctuating interest rates, general geopolitical instability with very worrying wars going on in various parts of the world, where Europe is feeling very touched, as is America. These elements have sort of eroded purchasing power and general confidence, and that's a really key element in the art market. General confidence. Do people feel like spending money on art, or do they feel nervous and think it's just not the right time to be spending, even if they do have the money and if the liquidity is there?
I see. So what might be normally considered to be a sensible strategy, which is because you said the art market is not very correlated with other markets, so it might be a good strategy to invest in art, but art is also affected a lot by the current political climate, it sounds like. So maybe it's not, what would your recommendation be? Should people invest in the art market to diversify their portfolios, or is that not necessarily the right strategy?
I think this is really, we're in a buyer's market right now. I mean, I came away from the New York sales thinking like this is the right time to buy. So in that sense, I think there are certain values to really be taken advantage of right now. And I'm suggesting to my collectors that we buy. There's opportunities there. There's really fantastic works that come up for auction that are selling at somewhat reasonable prices. Art is generally an illiquid asset. So it's really, I look at it more as a placement than an investment. It's a great way to transmit family patrimony. There's a lot of reasons to have art as part of a diversified portfolio. But along with buying art, there's many complexities and elements that one needs to know about. But the advantage of buying art is that it doesn't move, the values don't move in lockstep with stocks or bonds. So there is a certain removal from the everyday volatility of the art, of the financial markets.
Okay. Thanks a lot for that. Sounds super interesting. Lizzie, let's bring you into the conversation. And so let me just pick up on this point, which I think is a good segue into thinking about value the concept more generally, because Annika mentioned that female surrealists were undervalued. And so, obviously that raises questions about what drives value. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what you think collectors are looking for right now. What are the values? Now they're starting to buy female serialists, right? Why might they in the past not have bought them, but they're buying them now? How do collectors think about art as investment?
So I think, obviously we've been talking about the auction market quite a lot because we're talking about the sales. Um, and I guess the auction market is a good tester of the open market, but people don't just buy through auction; they buy through galleries, they buy privately, and I think as Annika said, there are a lot of opportunities out there, and people buy art not only, well, not necessarily as an investment, but as a kind of expression of a kind of extension of themselves and for their own values. So I think, you could look at the kind of discovery of the surrealists and the female surrealists in two ways. On the one hand, it could be people looking for opportunities which financial opportunities, especially if you're thinking about surrealism is on the up in general, then who can you buy where there might still be room for growth. Looking at the female surrealists would be a really good idea. And actually looking at women artists in general, I think your work has shown that that's potentially a very good investment. But then there are people who will be also doing that from a kind of standpoint of like their own personal values. Like I have a client who actively is a man, but he's actively decided that he's only going to buy works by female artists now because he wants to kind of redress that balance and support women. So I think there are lots of different reasons, why people collect. Can you remind me your question again? It was like I've lost the thread. But I think it's not just about the financial value at the end of the day. And I don't think that's necessarily what drives people. But what's quite nice is when I guess the two perhaps coalesce. But I think some people aren't necessarily thinking about supporting women. They're thinking about the financial opportunity. Some people are thinking about I'm just going to be realistic about that, and some people are thinking about supporting women. I think the thing is to unpick why somebody actually buys art is really difficult, but there's often it does come down to that personal taste and passion as well, and that is what makes it completely different to, I guess, the financial markets, because you've got your own personal values coming into it, and personal taste and cultural values and taste.
Yeah, art might be a bit more interesting than just buying a bond, right? A bit more exciting. Bit more
And at the end of the day, if you're going to hang it on your wall, you're going to which most of our collectors do buy for, they want to have something which speaks to them, aesthetically, as well as, I think it's nice for people to think. I think people do love the idea that it's growing in value, as in financially, but they also think, well, actually they also love it. That's when it's the best thing, is if you love it and also you feel like it's a good investment financially. But then you have the philanthropists who aren't really interested in actually the return, which I wish there were more collectors like this, but they really want to support artists, and this is perhaps more on a contemporary side of things, where people aren't looking at the kind of the resale, but they're actually just really invested in culture and supporting sort of the next generation. And that's probably at a different level of the market to obviously the New York sales, but it's really nice to have collectors who perhaps support both ends. On the one hand, they're looking to buy for investment, but on the other hand, they also kind of appreciate that you wouldn't have those artists unless you supported the new. So I guess somebody like Charles Saatchi, most famously, is quite well known for having done that. Having sort of supported the younger artists, the YBAs, and actually then that has become it happens to have become fashionable, as well. So yeah, it's art is an interesting thing. It's quite undefinable sometimes, the reasons behind things. But I guess, like Annika says, there are sort of trends, but they are different to necessarily the financial markets. They might be more related to cultural trends.
Right. So maybe now's a good time to ask the audience what they think. So we're going to do a little audience poll. And so the question that I'm going to ask the audience is, what do you believe is the true purpose of collecting art? So I'll give you a couple seconds to fill it out. All right, so hopefully, okay.
Two of those questions were the same. Two of the answers were the same.
Oh, okay. All right. So even better because and I think it was maybe the one that was chosen. So the audience tends to believe that the purpose of collecting art is to enrich life through beauty and meaning. So that's an interesting response, especially given, the fact that, art does have a financial value, but that just shows that value can have many meanings, right? It's not just about the money, it's also about enriching life. Thanks, everyone for participating. So let me just let me just briefly continue on this point about so Annika was talking about a lot of the financial side, and you believe it is a good investment. Lizzie, you were talking about the passion and the story and the meaning behind the art. So do you think it's possible to do both? Can you invest both for the passion and the money? Like, can you make money off of your values, I guess? Or can you make
Um,
back off of values?
I think so. I think I'd like to think you can. I mean, for me, I think that's where it's really exciting is when you get somebody who's really buying art because it's an extension of their identity and extension of their values, and they've got a real mission to support artists from perhaps a certain community, whether that's and a kind of, I don't know, supporting women artists or supporting queer artists, or it might be supporting artists from your own country. But it's quite fun when people sort of collect in that way, because then I guess one part of collecting, or sometimes people might just get into it to one area, for example, collecting surrealism or collecting Bloomsbury artists. And I think when people really get a passion, that's when it becomes really exciting, because then it's about kind of discovering all the intervening and intermediary figures as much as the big hitter names, and then that's when your knowledge becomes enhanced as a collector. And then you find out more and more about the different stories behind the individual artworks, behind the artists, and you might get drawings and studies for larger artworks, and then it's the connections between different things in, say, your collection or what you're seeing that becomes kind of interesting. I don't know whether Annika finds out with her collections, but often you might have a collector who's bought a really a significant painting, and then when the study comes up maybe a few years later, there's nothing nicer than to sort of highlight that to your collector to say, hey, this have you seen this, it relates to your picture. And that's always a nice thing, is it's the story between the works that you have in your collections, which are just as amazing and enriching as the actual visuals of the art. I don't know, Annika, if you've got experience with that as well.
Absolutely. The dialogue that you can create within a single collection can enrich the whole. So it does become sort of the sum of its parts. And that can create value in the long term. But I think the important thing, I mean, I touched upon the idea of the art being sort of illiquid as an asset. When you buy art, it's not it's very difficult to turn it around in a year or two and make a profit. I mean, that's sort of a different class of buyers. Those are people who speculate, and they're not really what we consider, correct, Lizzie, collectors. They're more consumers, or they're very active in the market, and they buy something and then sell it, maybe 6 months later, when especially with contemporary art, when the market is at its height. And if you miss that moment, the value can dramatically decrease. Contemporary art is very volatile. So collectors who take their time to create an environment where the works dialogue with each other, and even individually, if the values are not necessarily that high to begin with, over time, and as a whole, it can become something that's more valuable. But you do need to look at buying art as also a long-term placement. It's not in very few cases can it be turned around for profit. There's additional costs that are involved in collecting art that add to the bottom line, and those all need to be factored in as well.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. So I think it's interesting that you raise, both of you sort of touched on this point. There's the value of an individual artwork, but then also a collection can become more valuable than some of its parts because of the connections and the stories between them, which I think is a really interesting point. And that might
Definitely.
sort of lead us into maybe a bit, for those of the audience members who are interested in like, how do you actually start a collection? Right. So like one thing we can talk about is like, how do you think about investing in individual artwork? But maybe we can also talk a little bit about how you become a collector, and how we might want to approach that sort of path.
The other thing I'd say is that actually the collections, like the some of the parts become more interesting, but also some of the most interesting auctions. I mean, there was an one that you mentioned, Annika. It's a collection that belonged to a couple. Often, the single owner collections themselves also, because of the provenance, then become extremely valuable, in the future. Or you can just think of like the Elton John collection, for example. Buying something that's been in his hands has a certain cachet, or the Duchess of Windsor, or so that's where the actual owner also becomes part of the provenance, which then increases the kind of the value of the whole. And then I think it's like who you are, and I guess it becomes about your identity as well, and what you love is what's then expressed in your collecting. And then if you can find things that you're interested in and themes that you're interested in, I think for me that would be like the best way to start collecting, by thinking about what you're what interests you in the world around you, what excites you, whether it is that you want to support. I mean, my specialism is 20th century British arts, and so I do have a love for sort of post-war British art. I just saw somebody put something in the chat, but that's because that's kind of what I've learned about. But I also lived in Italy, years ago, and there's nothing I love more than sort of also going to like the Siena exhibition at the National Gallery and looking at Italian Renaissance art. So I think you find things that you can be a collective, but that sort of speak to your own story as a human being, and for me that's the best way to start collecting art, because then you feel like you've got that connection. So then it's not about the money, it's about what the thing is that you want to bring in, and hopefully so you can start collecting just by supporting local galleries, if you want to start at an entry level, or looking at local auctions. But you still, I think educating yourself is really important, going to exhibitions, getting involved with the local art scene, but also keeping your eye on different markets. And I think auction is quite a sort of it's another level, so you really have to know what you're doing if you're going to buy or sell at auction. And that's possibly where people like Annika and myself come in, because it's quite a different marketplace, and there's so many different, I mean, even the language around it can be quite exclusive. Not that it's meant to be, but I think you need to understand how that works. So it might be worth going to auctions or looking at them online, but I think you may need to get some special advice if you're thinking about auctions. I don't know, Annika, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, first and foremost, I think if you want to start building a collection, you do have to think about sort of your intent and, define your passion. The bottom line in collecting art is that it is about personal enjoyment. I think, Lizzie and I probably work with the same profile of collector, whereby obviously when you buy art, no one wants to lose money, but the collectors that we work with are first and foremost collectors driven by passion, and not necessarily speculators. I think speculators tend to work on their own trajectory and not necessarily with art advisors. We sort of are here to accompany the long-term collector, generally speaking. So I think, it should be an activity that's driven by passion, and you do have to then, once you sort of determined what you love and what you want to live with and what you want to see on your walls every day, you do have to educate yourself, visit museums, read books, understand what you're looking at. I think it is helpful to be accompanied at a certain level. Buying at auction is very complex. It's also very complex because you don't necessarily control the price. The prices can very quickly get out of control. It's even as an art advisor, I find it's difficult to advise at auction, because you can advise one price, But then if there's a driven underbidder, somebody behind you who really wants the work and who's willing to disregard the ultimate value and they just want to acquire the work, what do you advise your client in that sense? You say, well, look, it's going to be a little bit expensive, but if you love it, that's okay too, as long as you know what you're getting into. But it is very difficult to control the value at auction. Buying privately, you have a little bit more flexibility and discussion room. But everybody wants to make smart financial decisions, even when they're collecting through passion. And also, I guess the legal, the legal ramifications, the statute of a work. There are works that are in Geneva, and if they're imported into a country, you have import taxes. So to understand the tax structure as well is important when you're buying, to understand, what the statute of the work is of itself. There's many elements that come into play in terms of buying that are important to look at.
So it sounds to me like, from what you're saying, that maybe first you have to define your passion. So if you're looking to get into the art market, you have to figure out what your passion is, and then maybe don't go straight to the auction. Maybe primary market is better than secondary market. Is that sort of what you would advise someone who's looking to get into this market? Or?
I guess you can take your time, in primary market, and I guess that's what Annika's saying. Decisions have to be made very quickly and very confidently at auction, and you have to do a lot of due diligence before you get there, and you might only have a couple of days to do that in. So you may not be equipped to do that. You might not even physically be able to get there. So buying from the primary market is, much more relaxed and in many ways a very nice experience for people, and you can often get to know a body of an artist's work all at once by going to an exhibition of an artist or a couple of artists, as opposed to seeing one work in isolation and not having any context for it among lots of other works from a similar period that just happened to be up in the same auction at the same time. It's very random. It's not, I know they try to curate the auctions to some extent, but they're not curated. It is a market where there's somebody who wishes to sell for various reasons at that point, which are amalgamated with other people's desires to sell. Whereas when you're going to the primary marketplace, you've got the opportunity to develop a relationship with gallerists, with dealers, who can perhaps also look out for you, but also you can make the decisions in a longer, and not under so much pressure. And I guess, and that's the role that that part of the marketplace has to play. It's so much nicer to be able to not be pressurized and not sort of be, not to have to take rushed decisions. And I think in particular it's nice to be able to see more than one work by an artist at the same time and have that comparison if you can. It obviously depends on what you're buying. I mean, for buying contemporary art, it's always lovely, especially if you go to, if you're able to, it's always nice to be able to meet the artist, and sometimes you can do studio visits, which can be a very special thing to do with their representative. Is the usual way to do it. If they've got a gallery, also there's certain etiquette in the art world, about how you go about these things. But obviously it's a very special experience seeing things in an artist studio and having that kind of access, and then having that understanding of how an artist works. So a lot of people like collecting contemporary art for that reason, because they love that connection, that direct connection with the artist and meeting them. But then some people, want to collect, 17th century Dutch, so it depends on, and that might be for very personal reasons. It might be because their parents did, it might be because they saw an amazing exhibition that really inspired them, so again, it's a very personal reason why people go off in different directions, but often it's an amazing journey that can, you have incredible, I mean, again, Annika and I probably have similar collectors, but you can have some most incredible people who are business people who do completely different things, for their day job, and they have this absolute passion about, their collection or their art or jewelry or whatever it is, and it's completely different to whatever business that they're in. And I think sometimes that's rather nice about the jobs that we do, is that actually we're bringing that joy into people's lives who are perhaps under a lot of pressure in another way, and actually we're able to help advise people with something that sort of is kind of, I guess it's, I'm thinking, it's there for enjoyment and well-being and all all sorts of other reasons, not just about sort of splashing their money around. It's a pleasure to be able to kind of, as well as a privilege to be able to buy art, and and that's something that collectors enjoy. So yeah, I think then it's something you want to take your time with and not rush. And I love what Annika's saying about speculators. I've not heard that phrase before, but it's a very good way of putting it. There's a huge difference between collectors and speculators, and it's speculating isn't something, I guess, as art advisors, that we're not there for the speculators, as Annika says. We're there for the collectors, and for the long term. You do have to have that long term lens when entering into this realm, really.
Yes.
Yeah, I would echo what you say, Lizzie. I mean, I think it's really important to take your time when you're starting out in building a collection. I also think art fairs are a great place to go to help hone your own taste. I wouldn't recommend necessarily buying at an art fair when you're beginning, because you do have to make, just like at the auction, you have to make a very quick sort of snap decision. Otherwise, the work could be sold 5 minutes later and you miss it. So you do feel like this pressure when you're at an art fair to make a quick decision, which is not necessarily the right thing to do when you're just starting out. But it's a great way to see a lot of material, to understand the prices that are being asked, and to create relationships with dealers. Because even if you don't buy at that particular fair, and if you go back even a week or a month later and say, actually, this work that I saw, it's still with me. It really resonated. I'm still thinking about it. I really like this artist's work. Can you show me what else they have done? What else you have available? You can go back to that, and there is most likely going to be more material available, and you won't feel that, that need to make a quick decision, where you could make ultimately kind of what would be a mistake, because you think, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I mean, I know many people who've bought things on the spot, and even a few days later, like, actually, I don't think I really wanted that, or, so take your time. That's really an important lesson. I mean, you can make those snap decisions when you're really comfortable with what you love, where you're going, what your collection needs, because then you have an instinct about, what would work in terms of what you already own, and you have a clear vision. But when you're just creating that vision, it's better to take your time and not make too quick of a judgment call.
Same with selling. Same with selling. When it's gone, it's gone. So if you're, so if you're not sure, if you're not sure, don't put it in the auction, or don't sell it, because then be sad that it sold for less than you wanted it to sell it for. That's also something that happens. Just because somebody told you might make some money, like, that's the worst reason, really. You have to be clear that you want to sell. And sometimes I was talking to someone the other day, sometimes people build up collections. I don't know, someone was saying to me they built up a collection of a neo-romantic artist, and they just obsessively collected this artist for like 10 years, and then they just sold the whole lot because they were like, I'm bored, and now I'm going into ceramics. So I think that's also where it can be quite fun. Like, you can change, you can suddenly decide, actually, okay, I've had my moment, that's been fun, but I'm done now, and I just want to start something new.
That's a really interesting point, that once you take time both in the buying and the selling, but then you can also, like, I mean, there's so many ways to create value through art. It's not just about the individual piece, it's about changing the style, or, I mean, many different dimensions, right? So it's like super interesting. So maybe we can ask the audience another question, just to they think about what we're talking about. And so I'm going to ask the audience, we're going to put up another poll question. So how important is storytelling or provenance in your appreciation of art? And so there's 4 responses. Okay, so thanks for responding. All right, and maybe so we did have a question that so I think Lizzie touched on this, but I don't think we got Annika's response to Jocelyn's question about what art you're drawn to. And
I'm just seeing that now, sorry.
Uh,
Well, I actually collect myself as well. It took me a really long time to start collecting because obviously I am in this business because I love art and I most especially love defending the artist's work and perpetuating the market for the arts for these artists, which means they still exist. So that defense of the artist's work is really important to me. And I also love this aspect of sort of like matchmaking, finding the collector that can be passionate about the work and bringing the two together. So those are like the drivers in my professional life. And personally, because I see so much art, it was really difficult for me in the beginning to sort of commit to my own taste. And for many years, I lived with nothing on the walls. I had white walls, absolutely nothing, not even a poster. And I have since changed tactic, and now I have a lot of works on paper. I tend to collect black and white works, very monochromatic. But I have two themes in my collection, which are early works, early works by artists who tend to look at other artists, which is a tradition in the artistic schools where an impressionist artist would go to the Louvre and copy the work of a master. So I have some 19th century art where the artist is looking at another artist's work. And I also really like sculptors' works on paper. So how a sculptor transforms their vision of an object into a flat plane. So I have sculptors' drawings. So those are sort of my two themes that I really love.
okay.
I love that. I can also really relate to like finding it difficult to commit to your taste when you love so many different things. And actually, one of the things I always love is works on squared paper, squared for transfer, because it feels like that's when you're really close to the ideas. So you can get an early Bridget Riley, for example, or just a preparatory study, and if it's squared for transfer and it's black and white, there's something really I know it feels quite visceral and exciting because you're really there with the kind of inception of the idea. So that's something I love in particular as well. But
I love this the fact that it's not necessarily so straightforward to start collecting, right? Because you have to figure out what you like and there may be so many different things and how do you choose? So I mean, I think that's a really important point because sometimes it seems very straightforward, but if even people in the art world say that, well, it's not so obvious necessarily, you have time to explore, right? I think that's really, really important. Okay, so we had 40% of people who said that storytelling was important, essential, I guess. So that's interesting, which also relates to, maybe sometimes the story is important, maybe other aspects of the artwork is important, maybe other aspects of collecting are important. So do you think, if you think about 40% as a number, do you think this sort of reflects, like, Annika, you mentioned the term speculators. Like, what do you think the composition of art buyers is like, or both of you, how would you characterize a typical profile of art buyers today? Like, do we have more of the passion investors, or are there many more speculators entering the market? How do you think the market has changed in that dimension?
Well, I think it's you really have to look at it by category. I think the cutting edge contemporary market has a lot of speculators who are active in that market. It's a very volatile market, so people tend to buy and sell with great rapidity because an artist who could be hot today, a year from now, could be unsaleable. So the nature of collecting contemporary art requires a certain level of of prowess in terms of when you buy and when you sell. And that tends to appeal more to speculators than to collectors, I would say. So in the contemporary, cutting edge contemporary, I would say probably more speculators than collectors. Whereas the more traditional markets, I think there's more, long-term collectors than speculators. The markets that are mature, such as 19th century, early 20th century, we tend to have more long-term collectors than speculators, I would say. I don't know what Lizzie thinks about that from her perspective.
No, I agree. I think the contemporary market is known for sort of what we call flipping art as well, buying in one buying in one jurisdiction and then selling in another. I think that goes on mostly in the contemporary market. I don't know if it happens so much, but it was happening quite a lot at one point. And then I think the more established, the older kind of artists, and I guess also because perhaps they're slightly more well known, things tend to be held on for longer. People tend to appreciate them for longer, and they're not just kind of assets, but just sort of flipped around. People, I think it does vary, like Annika says. I think that there are certain types of collectors who are always looking for that turn, and ultimately, as an advisor, that's always, I don't know, there's not really, it's very difficult to have a long-term relationship with those kinds of people. I find because it's not about kind of how the art communicates and sort of understanding actually the long-term value of the work. It's all so short-termist. It's kind of it's just that there's a different outcome, and I guess we're not financial advisors, we're art advisors at the end of the day. So I don't know, I think that's quite difficult, and it's quite difficult if you say have sold something to somebody and then you realize that they just flipped it 6 months later, because what Annika says about matchmaking, that's what I feel like is the most rewarding part of the job. It is exactly that. I feel like you sort of a matchmaker for artists and people, and there's that wonderful feeling when you feel like you've just got the perfect piece of art for the right collector, and it's like there's a relationship there that you've understood between the two, and it's almost, even if the artist isn't alive, there's a connection between this person who's alive today with something in the past. And there's something really beautiful about kind of how art can communicate non-verbally, and a collector can kind of connect into that. For me, that's one of the kind of exciting things, and that's also kind of what we're doing with the business school, right? It's like we're putting up art as a way to kind of showcase values, values of like who we are as a society, how we appreciate creatives, how art is something that adds value to our lives because it enriches us, mentally and, in our everyday. And to me, that's kind of the most important thing that art has, whatever the value of it, like monetary, the value for me that's most important is how it makes me feel inside, and how art does communicate to us as a society. And I guess we are custodians of that as we go through our lives, and different people are able to be custodians at different levels. But again, it's about supporting artists. This is a lovely Oxfordshire artist who I love, called Alice Price, for example, and then I've got Howard Hodgkin in the background. Two very different artists, but I love them both and equally, and I think that's what's really important when it comes to collecting art. It's that you find people, I feel like you find artists who communicate to you, whether they're alive or dead, in a way that just sort of they're saying something that really matters. And I think, to me, that's what's really important.
Yeah, so I think that sort of maybe brings us to a natural segue into a question about, like people who invest for passion, and then there are obviously maybe potentially more people nowadays who are investing for to flip art or speculation. I guess the art as sort of like a barometer of the values of our society. Do you think that's going to be diminishing in future, or do you see that art will continue to play this important societal function in terms of reflecting our values?
I think arts and exhibitions do play that part of reflecting our values, but I think if you're looking at the art market, it perhaps doesn't, because there's maybe a lag, because it's the people who have money who define what happens in the art market, and there may be a lag in terms of like diversity and equity of who's got that spending power. But if you look at the museums, and if you look at, I guess, our public institutions, that's more where the litmus paper will be in terms of like what our values are. So if you look at programming of art, that I think that is where you'll see the greatest sense of, like, at the moment there's more diversity, there are more female exhibitions. I think Tracey Emin was the first ever to have a solo exhibition in the Royal Academy 2 years ago as a female artist, which was absolutely astonishing. To think that only happened in, I think, was it 2023 or something like that. But so things are definitely changing, but I think you'll see it more in the public programming, where I guess money isn't so much of an issue, and as different generations also kind of putting the public programming together, perhaps then the kind of random selection of people who are kind of economically able to kind of have a place in the market. I think it's perhaps it's a different, the museums have a different agenda, so they're kind of freer from kind of commercial. I mean, they're under, they also have commercial imperatives, but they don't have, it's not quite the same, I guess I'm trying to say. I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay, all right. Annika, what do you think about the art market's role as, reflecting societal values?
Well, I think it's the art that has always reflected, and served as sort of a record of human experience. And that has been the case for centuries, even maybe 2,000 years since the art has been sort of created and publicly traded. So I think that the market itself is not necessarily a reflection of society's values. The works are, and the market just is there to sort of decide who gets to own what. I guess it's not, I don't think that because today, for example, female artists or Black artists, because they're being sold with more frequency now and they're sort of more popular, they've always existed, and these artists have been working for decades. So the art has been there, but the market just hasn't paid that much attention. So the art was being produced and was already reflecting society's values, and it's just the market that's actually catching up with that now. So
I think that's a great point. So maybe that brings us to, so we're basically at time. So, I think there are interesting points that came out in this webinar, and hopefully the audience agrees that the concept of value is more complicated than just financial value, right? A collection can be worth more than the sum of its parts. The storytelling is important. The collector may be important. The collector themselves, they can add value to the art. So there are many interesting dimensions of value of art that people may not think about. And I think that Annika and Lizzie have brought, really interesting perspectives on these issues. And I think also this point about, the art always reflects society, right? But some art may be financially more valuable at a given point in time. But if we also recognize that the storytelling is important, then as societal values shift, then there may be financial opportunities. So understanding the link between the passion and the financial value can be profitable from a monetary perspective as well as a values perspective. And so we're going to be actually following up on this theme in a future webinar where we're going to be talking about the undervaluation of women's art, a topic that we also discussed here a little bit. And so we're going to dig a bit deeper into that topic and discuss, why is women's art potentially undervalued, and what does that mean, and what does that also tell us about how the art market works? And that also relates a lot to current discussions about, the myth of meritocracy that are going on with, people are cutting DEI programs and, whether that makes sense. And so lots of interesting questions that we can elaborate on using the art market as an example. So with that, I'd like to really thank Lizzie and Annika for their amazing contributions, really interesting, so much more to talk about, but we're out of time. So thanks to our audience for participating and for joining this webinar, and please do look at the recording or pass on the recording and tell your friends about the interesting, topics that we're touching on, and please do reach out if there are other topics that you think we should be looking at. So thanks very much to both of you, and hope to see you again soon.